Hi. I'd just like to thank you first for organising this conference. It's a real honour to be invited amongst these guests. And yeah, I would just like to say thank you to the museum as well. It's very nice. So Jason and I, for the past year and a half, have been working on monthly estimates of the monetary base for the UK as it was in 1841 to 1870. So we're looking at the period of the maturation of the Industrial Revolution. And it's in the tradition of Forrest Cappy and Webber in the UK, who wrote on the monetary history of the United Kingdom. And they began their series in 1870. So it's appropriate that we're presenting this for the first time in Denmark, actually, because we came up with this idea that this would be a really easy paper to do about a year and a half ago, and we've been collecting data ever since, just on this 30-year period. And unfortunately, for us, we thought coin would be really easy, but actually coin became the nightmare of this paper, but we think we've solved it now. So yeah, we look at the monetary base in the tradition of Friedman and Schwartz, who did this for the USA. We have Lars Jonung in Lund University, who did something like this for Sweden. And although we're not kind of selling the monetarist case, we see that money is a great variable to tell you a lot about the functioning of the economy, the transaction economy. So I'm going to go through the monetary base and what we define it as in the same tradition as Cappy and Webber. I'm going to then look at the sources and methods, and then I'll hand you over to Jason, who's going to look at the results. So the monetary base is defined as the total potential reserves of the banking system. That's also the liabilities of the total liabilities of the monetary authorities. We all think of the Bank of England today as the monetary authority, but actually in these days it was all commercial banks who had joint stock banks and private banks who had the ability to print their notes, and of course the Royal Mint. So formally the base is defined as the public holding of currency and the banking reserve. The public holding of currency is the coin and notes and banknotes in circulation. Bankers' balances and banking reserves make up the reserve at the Bank of England, and we had to deduct currency held against the note issue to avoid double counting. So we had to start from somewhere to get the estimates of the public holding of currency. Particularly with coin, this would be a difficult process, but we found two. We used Jevons' estimate of 1868. Jevons was a professor of political economy in Manchester, I believe, and William Newmarch was a banker, an economist and statistician, and he came up with the first estimate of the stock of coin in the UK economy. It was gold coin. And he said that it was 36 million, but he did not include the money inside in the Bank of England. So we added that, and we arrived at a figure just under 42 million. Cappy and Webber have also accepted the Jevons figure of 1868. So we had a starting and an end point, and we thought that after that we could quite easily come across the flows of coins. So this is how we estimated the coin flows. So this is coin at the current time. Less coin in the previous period, plus the additions in this period minus the deductions and the Bank of England holdings of coin. So of the three types of coin, you had gold, silver and bronze, gold making up the bulk of the British monetary base. When gold was withdrawn, it was usually withdrawn through, in fact it was only withdrawn through the Bank of England, whereas silver and bronze came through the commercial banking system. All of these we received from the daily account books at the Mint. So we went through it day by day and added up each one to get the monthly figure for each. So it took quite some time. We then had net recorded exports, that's bullion and coin. The coin, as we heard earlier, was also exported to places like Portugal because it worked that way, Brazil. Then we had net unrecorded exports, which would be immigrants, particularly immigrants we used the same figure as Cappy and Webber. We took £2.50 was the average monthly wage at the time, and we deflated that back to arrive at an estimate of how much. So we had the number of immigrants and we multiplied it by that. And then of course we had melting. There was two great recoinages in the period. One was gold, that took place between 1842 to 1845. And there was one of bronze in the 1860s, or copper, which then became bronze. And silver, thankfully, happened in the 1870s, so we did not have to deal with that, because I don't think we could have taken another recoinage in the data. The banknotes were relatively easier by comparison because the data for this was much more easy to discern. We didn't have to make any estimates. It was published after the Bank Act. We had to make some assumptions before 1844, but that's only 2 years of data. So it includes all of the Bank of England notes that they pushed into circulation, private and joint stock banks of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. We had monthly data on the circulation, as I said, from British parliamentary papers, because there was a big banking versus currency debate at the time in the United Kingdom. So this was very well documented. We went to the Bank of England archives, and of course the Bankers magazine published the circulation and the reserves held against the notes. So the currency debate won the argument of the day. So banknotes were considered to be too dangerous to be allowed amongst the private banks in an uncontrolled fashion. So this is when the Bank of England actually gains power, and the caps, the bank issue of notes of the commercial banks is capped, so giving way to the Bank of England. The 1845 Act, which is the act which applies to Scottish and Irish banks, by comparison is quite different. It allows the Irish and Scottish banks to continue to issue notes above their legal limit, just like the Bank of England, but it has to be backed 100% by specie, which is coin, gold and 1/3 silver. So also in Scotland and Ireland, you have this tradition of small denomination of banknotes. This is also allowed under the 1845 Act. In England, these banknotes are not allowed. So this makes a big difference to the estimates of the monetary system, because the Scottish and Irish banks can issue far more notes under a lower denomination, which would mean that you would expect coin, which circulated widely in England and Wales, to be less apparent, particularly gold, in Scotland and Ireland. So to arrive at the final figure for the public holding of currency, we had to deduct all of the till money for the commercial banks to arrive at the appropriate estimate. Finally, we had to have a look at reserve cultures. I'm just going to do the reserves and then hand you over to Jason. The reserve of the UK banking system is bankers' balances. All banks of the system, or at least a great deal of them, held their reserve at the Bank of England. That's the first part of it. Then the last part I'll come to first, actually. That's the entire till money of the commercial bank system, which is all of the commercial banks' reserves, minus that part of the reserve which is held purely against notes. That's to avoid double counting again. And lastly, the Bank of England's own bank reserve, not against notes, but for bank transactions. That equation you see underneath is just an assumption we had to make for 3 years, and that's the reserve against all. We had data for the reserve against all of the public liabilities, which is the denominator here. Public liabilities are the deposits and the notes of the banking system. And we multiply that by the proportion of notes of public liabilities to arrive at a fair reserve for note. The reserve cultures differed between all countries of the United Kingdom at the time. We had gold in circulation as a medium of exchange in England and Wales, as I stated. In Scotland, not at all. They had a very they had the most superior banking system out of all of the kingdoms. It was very paper-based already at that stage. Adam Smith had praised it in The Wealth of Nations. In Ireland, the banks only held gold as a measure against panic. It was not actually circulated. And banks were not legally obliged to redeem their notes. So if you came to a bank in England or Scotland asking to be paid out in gold, they would tell you to go to the head office in London. In Ireland, that was not the case. In Ireland, you had to redeem it at every branch. So that meant you had to hold more gold. So you can see this across the reserve ratios. Scotland holds very little gold against paper because people actually trust paper money more than gold in Scotland. There's a longer history of stability with paper money. And as you see again, Scotland and Ireland have low denomination notes circulating as legal currency, which obviously payroll. I'll just hand you over to Jason now.
Thanks a lot, Sean. So I have the pleasure of taking you through the results. As you can see from this graph, the blue area here is coin in circulation. And this dominates our monetary base and actually increases over time, which came as a surprise to Sean and I. There's also some interesting features in each of the decades. The 1840s, again to our surprise, is a relatively stagnant decade, despite the Great Recoinage and the Irish famine. It doesn't come up in this quite broad measure here, but we'll see it in a more subtle measure later. The 1850s, on the other hand, is very exciting. There's a steep increase in the base. This is driven exclusively by coin, and it's a consequence of large bullion inflows, which began in the early 1850s. The average growth rate in this period is about 3.7% a year. The 1860s is not quite as interesting. The growth rate's a little bit less, about 0.75% per year. And we have a financial crisis in 1866, the Overend and Gurney crisis. That doesn't quite show up here, but it will show up a little later. There are two competitors, really, for this paper, or maybe that's too strong a word, but there are two existing estimates that overlap with our period. The first is Huffman and Lothian. They had a paper back in the 80s who also estimated the base for the UK. And this is just our results compared to theirs. A couple of things stand out. Our base is a little more volatile. That's because it's a monthly series. Theirs is an annual series. Also, we start a little higher, and the growth rate's a bit more subtle than theirs. And this result emerges from the differences in processes, really. Huffman and Lothian use one primary source. Sean and I have got sort of upwards of 50. And we include more detail, particularly with coin. Huffman and Lothian didn't take account of the melting of coin, and this was quite an extensive practice in the 19th century. And by our estimates, this summed to about £30 million over the 30 years. They also don't account for the coin exported by emigrants, and that's kind of the standard practice to do so. And of course, in this period, it's particularly important because we've got one of the greatest emigration episodes in sort of human history in the early 1840s in Ireland, so we take care of that as well. A minor point, they don't take care of copper coin, and that's quantitatively not important, but we've all come to Copenhagen here to discuss coins, so we thought it's appropriate to put in the work and construct a separate series for copper as well. The other existing estimates, we have 1 year of overlap with Cappy and Weber. And this series here displays both of ours on the same graph, and they're actually not spliced, they're very close together. There's about £5,000 difference in 1870 out of about 140 million. So I've just put these two together for the 19th century, and you see that the growth in the early part, 1840 to 1870, is not exceptional in a longer term context. That's what continues into the tail end of the century as well. We've done a bit of econometrics, something simple. We've used the sort of standard test for structural breaks, and the test throws up 4 significant structural breaks. One in 1850, another in 1855, 59, and in 66 as well. The first 3 are related to large bullion inflows, but the fourth one is a little more interesting. It's related to the Overend and Gurney crisis that I just mentioned. The Bank of England raises its discount rate quite extremely, and that has some implications for the base. We've also tried to tease out the seasonality in the data, and we've got some graphs here for you, but I'll draw your attention to the sort of top right panel. This is the seasonal component, and this method is basically, it decomposes a time series into a trend, a sort of cyclical component and a seasonal component, something like a Hodbrick-Prescott, but with this extra seasonal component. And the bandwidth of the seasonal component reduces over time. And we've gone back to the censuses of the period, and in the 1841 census, the share of the labour force in agriculture is about 1/3. By the 1861 census, it's about a quarter. And we see the reduction in the seasonality stemming from money demand coming from the agricultural sector. As that diminishes, the bandwidth of the seasonality and the money supply reduces. It increases again in the 1870s despite an increase in, a further decrease in a structural change. So we haven't quite managed to explain that decade. We've looked into weather, and it was a particularly wet decade, but it's difficult to infer how that's relevant. Finally, we just wanted to look at attrition rates because many other studies that try to construct these coin stocks, they suffer from less data than we've been able to find, and it's typical to just have output data when you're going far back in time. So the procedure really is to use some sort of what they call a rate of attrition, and in the literature you find that this is typically between 2 and 4%, but the implied attrition rate for our series would be 6%. And if you use 2% on our output data, it would leave you in 1870 at a base that's 58 million too high. So you can see that these attrition rates, they're very sensitive and can lead to wildly overestimated or underestimated results. The take home here is I'm not sure whether we're suggesting that the attrition rate should be different, but perhaps they should be used sensitively. And it could also be that this period in history is very unique because of the extensive cross-border flows of gold coin from Britain and also the great recoinage that Sean mentioned earlier. Just to go through the conclusion, as you know by now, we tried to create some high-frequency estimates of a relatively unexplored period in UK monetary history, and we've tried as far as possible to make it consistent with the estimates that exist a bit further in the future to give us a long-run series from the 1840s up until the present day. The key result really is that there's a slower growth rate than previously expected. Ours is about 1.6% over the entire period. The existing one was about 3.6%. And what this implies is that the level of the monetary base in the 1840s was much higher than we previously realised. It's also highly seasonal, and we interpret this as probably driven by money demand as opposed to money supply. And the attrition rate of 6% is higher than those found elsewhere in the literature. So thank you.